I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to talk about Russia's preventive measures. The mark on the wall. The moment when I saw my mother's face turn white with fear is crystal clear in my head. There were 3 of us in the room, me, my mother, and my grandmother. Certainly, both of them were white in the face. And I remember thinking, it's not a figure of speech, it's not a figure of speech. Until then, I had met the expression only in stories that my mother read to me. I connected it with horror movies I was too young to watch. And that's why my first reaction was an utter surprise. How could something like that have creeped up in the real world, in our bed chamber in front of the couch where me and my mom slept? It was in the beginning of 1980s and we were staying at my grandmother's on the western coast of Estonia. My mother was born and raised in this village before marrying my Finnish father and moving to Finland where I was born, and we traveled to my grandmother's as often as possible. It was not easy. At the time, Estonia was under Soviet occupation and traveling was strictly controlled. But once we managed to get there at last, my grandmother's huts were just as loving as always, and the grasshoppers were chirping, the bees buzzing all around us, and there were more butterflies than you could count, and I loved especially the peacock butterflies. But the moment I realized figurative expressions can manifest themselves in real life, it was cabbage butterfly outside the window. I could hear cows mooing in the distance. Nothing had changed except the expression on my mother's and grandmother's face. We had just returned from the neighbors to get fresh milk. My grandmother was the first one to enter the bedchamber, and as soon as she entered, she called my mother. Nothing else. She just called her name. My mother put the 3-liter milk churn on the kitchen floor and went to the chamber. I followed her, and upon entering, we saw my grandmother standing there, her face white with fear. In the blink of an eye, my mother looked the same. Both of them stared at the red rugs on the floor, sewn by my grandmother's skillful hands. Nobody had to say it aloud. The rugs were stained with mud, and the mud formed sharp footprints big enough to be a man's, an unknown man's. We had locked the door when we had left for the milk, and we were not expecting visitors. Nobody shouldn't have been there, not in front of the couch on which we slept. We stood there staring at the footprints until some color returned to my grandmother's face and then to my mother's, and we made a tour around the house. Everything was in order. Nothing was taken. There was absolutely no sign of an unknown visitor except for the footprints. We went back to the chamber. The prints had not disappeared as I had hoped. There was no denying it. Somebody had been there. Somebody had left there signs of his visits, signs that couldn't go unnoticed, and we all knew that it was KGB. I'm certain that many of the first words I learned as a child were the same as that of the other children around the world, like a mother, a father, a butterfly, a dog, a cat. But in my case, in that collection of first words, belonged also the Russian language abbreviation for the State Security Committee, KGB. And the sole reason for that was my mother's Estonian heritage. It was only because she had moved to Finland from a Soviet-occupied country, and at the time all Estonians abroad were followed closely by the KGB. Traveling to see my grandfather was an all-year-round mission. You had 2 options. You could travel with a 4-day tourist visa to Tallinn, the capital of Soviet Republic of Estonia, but no further, and only if the Soviet Union issued the visa. The other option was an official invitation for a relative living abroad, but for that you must be a parent, a child, or a sibling of the invited, and in our case, the only person who met all the requirements was my aunt. For example, she lived in a city in a 3-bedroom apartment because she had three children, which was a requirement for such a big flat. This, however, also meant that she had square meters required for guests coming from the West. She had also learned Russian at school, unlike my grandmother, who had grown up in the Republic of Estonia with no compulsory Russian language lessons, so she couldn't have muddled through the Soviet bureaucracy. But above all, my grandmother lived in the most ordinary Soviet collective farm, not the exemplary one where Westerners might have been invited to for a tour. Every year, the KGB updated the routes, roads and the places deemed acceptable for foreign eyes, and the wheat fields and oak tree alleys my mother was brought up with didn't belong to that category. Therefore, we had to go there in secret, as long as the Soviet authorities first accepted the invitation and issued the visa. In the Soviet Union, public transport was quite good, but without official permission to travel to the countryside, we had to find another way to get there. Private cars were a rarity, so that was not an option. Quite often we found a cab driver who was willing to take us there. The mere contact to a Westerner was enough for them to do this favor, in addition to a generous tip, of course. But when my aunt made her way to the top of the car line after years of waiting, she finally managed to get permission to buy a car, and traveling to the countryside became a bit easier, and no one paid attention to her recognizable wheels. You might of course wonder why visiting my mother's childhood home was so important to us that we defied Soviet authorities. My grandmother had a bad leg, and in the USSR, traveling was far from accessible. But beyond all, my family had been living in the region for centuries. That's where we could find the family graveyard where my family members have been buried at least since the 17th century. No matter who ruled the country, it was home. After the mud had appeared on my grandmother's rugs, we went outside to discuss the incident. You couldn't have that kind of conversation in the house because in the Soviet Union all walls had ears. And maybe the footprints were a sign that political wings were changing. Maybe it was a sign that this would be our last visit. Maybe they wanted to persuade us to do something they wanted. They had tried that before, putting on the pressure through the so-called conversations, during which they reminded my mother of her parents' old age, implying that they wouldn't survive in the cold country, which was a euphemism for Siberia. But after the officer my mother had to meet changed to another one, a more humane one, he let it go. The officer walked my mother out and stopped her in the courtyard, far from the room where so-called conversation had took place, far from the recorder and far from the walls with ears, and he said, "Why bully old people?" But the footprints were definitely a reminder that we were being watched, that they knew where we were. So perhaps the footprints were a reminder that those visits could be taken away from us. As long as we acted like proper Soviet citizens, they let us go there in secret. They let us visit our family cemetery, and that was our award for folding in line. We didn't find muddy footprints again, but we did smell cigarette smoke a few times, even though none of us smoked. After that summer, we did continue our forbidden visits, but my aunt brought her dog to stay with us, and he could tell miles away if a stranger was approaching the house. We never got an explanation if our travel documents were not issued, let alone did we ever find out why letters sometimes disappeared. To be track on things, my mother and grandmother wrote down the dates when they sent or received their letters, and when they met, they compared the dates. You wouldn't discuss that kind of matter over the phone. The telephone calls had to be scheduled, and sometimes they went through. Sometimes you waited for a call that never took place with no explanation. We never found out the reason what was the reason behind the footprints on my grandmother's floor that summer. We had no idea how we, on that particular year, had managed to disturb this delicate stick and carrot practice, of which our visit to my grandmother's were a very good example. But this constant uncertainty was part of the game. This is how dictatorship teaches you obedience. You learn how to read the signs, you learn the rules from a very early age, and you learn how to play the game. You learn the system. And this is how new generations in Russia, Russian-occupied territories, and Ukraine learn the system. Most of the guidelines are non-verbal and expressed in some other way, and direct orders or bans make up only a thin layer of the system. Over the years, I've read endless KGB documents for the research I've conducted for my books, and the direct orders are surprisingly rare. In KGB documents, a very common euphemism is recommendations. The documents are filled with phrases like active measures are recommended. Not also the passive voice. Although orders, recommendations, and communications are signed with names, the text of the KGB documents is written in a passive voice, which erases the personal responsibility of the signatory. No one seems to be giving the orders to oppressed people. Everyone just follows the orders given to them. A complex bureaucracy where individual responsibility is effaced by change of command and the makeup of organization is familiar from Hitler's Germany, wherein the Holocaust was carried out by dehumanizing the Jews in stages and dehumanizing the enemies was also practiced in the Soviet Union. I don't know how footprints on my grandmother's rugs were documented. Maybe the answer could be found in the KGB archives, but alas, one of the terms in regaining the independence of Estonia was the peaceful transportation of the KGB archives to Russia. But even without seeing the documents of this particular case, I'd say it's unlikely that the KGB operative would have gotten a direct order to mess with my grandmother's hand-sewn rugs in front of the couch upon which we slept. It's more likely that this report where preventive measures are recommended, which has led to another report about how preventive measures have been taken, which has led to another report about how preventive measures have been taken with success. After Stalin's death, the Soviet Union gave up on mass repressions and switched to more selective means of pressure on individual people. The Soviet Union's reputation in the eyes of the international community improved, and the most ingenious tools were often the most affordable. Intimidation that made the target doubt their own sanity, and for which no one could be directly blamed. The KGB practiced prophylaxis, preventive measures, extensively. These included, for example, informal discussions at the KGB building. Yuri Andropov, who acted as the chairman of the KGB at the time, reported, for example, that between 1967 and 1974, 21,406 people were persuaded to give up activities harmful against the Soviet Union through prophylactic methods alone. In the same period, only 4,879 people were accused of political crimes. Only few one's names ended up on the lists of political prisoners maintained by human rights organizations in the West. Most of the targets would not have defined themselves as dissidents. They had no political intentions. Not more than we did, that is, none. Whilst the focus was on punishment during Stalin's rule, the next leader of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, decided to focus on preventing crimes, that is, dissent, before anything could happen. Prophylaxis was an umbrella term for general and individual preventive measures of opposition. General measures included things like legislation and school curriculum. Together with measures aimed at individuals, they formed a network of social control that would effectively prevent activities deemed anti-Soviet. My family didn't hold hard positions in the Soviet Union. We were not the privileged ones, quite the contrary. Before the occupations, my grandparents cultivated a small farm with few cows. The Estonian Land Reform Act of 1990 was passed in Estonia shortly after the country had gained independence in the previous year. The act expropriated land from the ethnic Baltic German landowners, which had previously made up much of the local landowning elite, and the land was distributed mainly to ethnic Estonian small farmers. The access to the land was quite an achievement to Estonians who had been living under serfdom for centuries. That's why freedom is of utmost value to Estonians, that the independence meant the end of the slavery. But the first Soviet occupation meant the beginning of the new one. Farmers strongly opposed forced collectivization, but the resistance was oppressed by forced deportations. Some of our family members were deported too. Some of us managed to flee to the west before the occupation. Some of us had been forest brothers, like my grandfather, a member of resistance movement. He survived, but some of us were killed by the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB. These were not backgrounds suitable to make a career in the USSR. This was not an appropriate family tree for the privileged ones. This was a family tree about which was best to keep silent. And even the smallest hint of the cold land was enough to keep you in check. Those tiny hints affected you like small electricity shocks, and you received them every day in different forms. Muddy footprints were picked from the top shelf of the KGB's warning stable, but the smaller and more discreet warnings came through the party-controlled media, TV, radio, presented in the Soviet language, which reminded us every day that we were those elements they talked about on TV, radio, in speeches, in regulations, in the official papers. The anti-Soviet or anti-social elements which ought to disappear from the Soviet Union on its path to the bright future. You could get reminded of your place even as you were running your everyday chores. When my Estonian grandmother went shopping in the city, she would encounter salespeople who spoke Russian. This was a respected profession in the Soviet Union because sales were guaranteed good opportunities for doing business under counter, and the sales staff was dominated Russian speakers, especially in department stores. Since self-service arrived in the Soviet Union quite late, and the shopping was done by asking the salesperson for an item and then having them retrieve the requested item from the shelf behind them. As an Estonian-speaking customer, my grandmother quite often received a response, "Speak human language." And thus, the positioning of non-Russian speakers as animals became a part of Estonia's everyday life. The default for human being was Homo Sovieticus, and the default for Homo Sovieticus was Russian. And even today in Russia, the human language is Russian, and all other languages are for animals. Now in Ukraine, the Russian torturers lash out to the Ukrainian-speaking victims, "Stop speaking pig-talk." In the Soviet Union, the salesperson had held a position of power. Those kind of positions were filled with Russians moving to Estonia after the occupation started. The population of Tallinn rapidly doubled despite the fact that Estonia had lost a quarter of its population during the war, and at the same, the paradigm of values changed. What had been respected before became tainted and stigmatized, a good cause for a slur, another reminder of which category you belong to the privileged ones, or to the ones who will be erased as a part of the construction process of the Soviet paradise. No wonder that in Ukraine, this led to a situation where Ukrainian-speaking parents started to speak only Russian to their children to secure them a better future, to protect them. The contemporary Russian colonization process continues to follow the same pattern that it has followed since the state started the conquest of Siberian lands in the 16th century. Population transfers, ethnic cleansings are targeted at the native population, many are replaced by Russians, and those few who remain are assimilated, that is, Russified. The region's own history and culture are exchanged for the conqueror's mythology. This is exactly how the Soviet Union occupied the Baltic states. This is exactly how they occupied the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. This is exactly how they have occupied territories in Ukraine since 2022. When the settlers came to Estonia after the occupation started, the Estonians were very confused to find that the new arrivals constantly called them fascists. And then, if Estonians were to travel to Soviet Russia, they encountered the same treatment. The rhetoric is exactly the same which Russia is now using to justify its large-scale invasion of Ukraine. From Russia's point of view, I'm fourth generation fascist. Russians started to call us that already 100 years ago in the school books. They even had an ethnic category for us, Esto-fascists. It was a general term for all people supporting the independent Republic of Estonia. The fact that the Russians considered the Balts to be fascist was not just because of Soviet press or school books. The state film industry also made sure that Soviet citizens did not forget what their arch-enemy looked and sounded like. In Soviet films, Nazis were always played by Estonian, Lithuanian and Latvian actors. Balts were always the ones putting on Nazi uniforms and going to battle against the Soviets. People often recognized these actors on the street and congratulated them for their performances, but for ideological reasons, they never received any awards. Sometimes, as a change of pace, these Baltic actors would get a chance to play an American or Western spy. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, everything changed in Estonia, and there we were again, me, my mother and my grandmother, in the countryside with no need to worry about travel documents. Step by step, little by little, we started to discuss formerly forbidden matters indoors, and the radio stopped talking about us as dangerous elements. We could actually listen to the programs instead of turning them off. TV and radio hosts, journalists, we, our family and everybody started to address the whole country as gulag and concentration camps, occupation as occupation, deportations as deportations. We stopped using euphemisms. We stopped hiding the real meaning between the lines. And it felt like I had been watching my whole life through static on my TV, and suddenly the screen was clear and I could see the picture. We even saw an Estonian flag. There was a shortage of practically everything, but my cousin who worked as a seamstress managed to get a piece of white cloth, a piece of black cloth, and a piece of blue cloth, the colors of Estonian flag. And we did something that had been unthinkable just a moment ago. We took a picture of us with flag in front of my grandmother's house. I hadn't actually seen the Estonian tricolour before. The entire color combination had been banned in the Soviet Union. Before now, the flag had existed to me only as a phrase my mother and grandmother had whispered, like a secret prayer, blue, white, black, as a synonym to Estonia and freedom. I understood then that the moment was historical. I understood why my grandmother cried. I understood everything, and yet I did not believe I could write about it. I had wanted to become an author ever since I was 6 years old, and the moment we stood there with the fresh Estonian flag was something never experienced before. Surely that would have been something to write about, but I didn't see it like that at all. As an aspiring author, one of my guidelines was Virginia Woolf's The Mark on the Wall. The first-person narrator in the story suddenly notices a mark on the wall that she hasn't seen before, and starts to wonder what it could be: a fingernail scratch, a rose petal, a crack in the wood. I read the text as an exhortation to look at everyday things with fresh eyes and write about the smallest details of life. That idea made an impression on me. A subject worthy of high art can be something as simple as a mark on the wall. So maybe I skipped to the historical moment with Estonian flag because it was something big. But what about the muddy footprints? One might think I immediately made the connection between the wolf's mark on the wall and the mud stains on my grandmother's carpet. Who could not see the connection? But I didn't. I simply didn't. I had started to make little literary rehearsals on everyday life, common things I could see around me, but I never touched upon anything behind the former iron curtain. I didn't actually see Estonian history as a literary subject at all. It mattered to me personally, in a very private matter, but art should be something more, something that could matter to others, to the world, right? In order to write a story, a subject has to feel significant. And the culture we grow up in defines our concept of what is important and what is not. In the Soviet climate, analyzing the occupation publicly was impossible, and at the same time that meant that it wasn't publicly important. It wasn't a publicly significant subject of art, and literature is always a public work of art. How could you even think of that your stories matter if you have them being tainted all around you, if you don't think that others are interested in reading them? In Finlandicized Finland, the mood was the same when I grew up. Even though Finland had retained its independence, the Soviet Union used its influence to interfere in its weaker neighbors' affairs. This was Finlandization. In addition to foreign policy, the practice also affected national defense, the economy, education, the press, publishing, and even which foreign artists visited Finland or which movies we were able to see. For instance, the movie adaptation of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was banned in Finland. The peace settlement that followed the continuation war 1941 to 1944 gave free rein to communists in our country. In the arts, which called me from a young age, communist paeans rang out loud and yet clear. Academic research wasn't safe either. Honest study of the Soviet Union's catastrophic economy and its society was ill-advised if you valued your career. Estonian immigrants had formed lively communities in other countries, but this was impossible in Finland. Taking part in the international friendship societies with the Baltic countries was considered anti-Soviet agitation, something which had to be stamped out according to the strict provisions of the peace settlement. So being Estonian in Finland was a lovely experience. My school books all said that Estonia had voluntarily joined the Soviet family. Of course, this wasn't true, but Finnish schools hewed closely to the tenets of Soviet historiography. The backdrop to this was the treaty Finland had signed in 1948 called the Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance. It allowed the Soviet Union to hold Finland in a tight grip. The Finnish National Board of Education, which reviewed our textbooks, abided with the requirements of the treaty, and the Soviet authorities were only too happy to offer additional guidance. Through school books, Finlandization became an integral part of education, contributing to shaping our national identity, historical memory and language. Whilst our books provided ample space for discussion of problems in the United States, they always cast the Soviet Union in a positive light. Finlandization stripped textbooks of any criticism of the USSR. Few Finns were direct eyewitnesses of what life was like in the Soviet Union, since travel to the East was restricted. As a result, parts of the population gradually began to believe the Finlandization narrative and thought the life in the collective farms were rosy. To Estonians, the Finnish naivety seemed absurd. So, as you can imagine, I wouldn't have ever thought to tell the story about the footprints on my grandmother's rug. Not in Finland. To most of the Westerners, they would have been just mud on the floor and nothing more. If we were to have claimed otherwise, we would have been considered insane, hostile, paranoid. The KGB guided the authors of Soviet history books through word lists, which were updated at regular intervals, resembled a kind of telephone directory or dictionary. Among other things, they consisted of epithets and the adjectives provided, which were meant to be associated with liquidated states, were stigmatizing and misleading. Correspondingly, adjectives to be associated with the Soviet Union rather evoked concepts such as greatness, splendor, triumph, victory, and other positive things. Nothing appeared in the Soviet Union that did not pass under the eyes of censors, and the Soviet language did not emerge naturally. KGB instructions and the redundant use of attributes were the rule. People's emotional reactions were important, and these were controlled through epithets. When certain things were only associated with words that evoked negative emotions, people began to feel disgust towards them. That is why the Soviet language was so tedious, ponderous, difficult to understand. But the main point wasn't understanding at all. The goal was to guide you to a certain way of thinking, a certain way of feeling. One of the KGB's favorite tools was reflexive control, in which the subject is led to take a certain decision seemingly independently through the control of the information they receive, even though the decision is against your own good. And they use this tool by manipulating language. Adjectives do matter, words do matter, the choice of phrases. If you never hear or read negative, neutral, or critical adjective related to a certain subject, it's very difficult for you to say or write them yourself. You learn by repetition, you learn by example, and the Soviet Union was very much aware of this. Putin himself doesn't want to see negative news before or after he's on TV in Russia. Wonder, where did he get that from? The poet Lev Rubinstein has defined propaganda as a kind of death. Only when meanings that correspond to reality have been restored to a language can it come to life and enlighten our minds, because we think in words. That is why the use of Soviet phrases in the Baltic countries was put to an end when the countries became independent again. The Soviet language was an ideologically pure language whose meanings did not correspond to reality, and propaganda imagery depicted a utopia in which certain elements would no longer exist. They strove to create their paradise by using language which made it real. Wiggle's postcolonial discourse in other former empires has dismantled the language of subjugation. The same did not happen in the Russian Federation. Although Russia's brief moment of democracy in the 1990s allowed the past to be addressed and explored more freely, the language of the Soviet era has never been condemned in Russia. That same language continued into the new millennium, and they started to use the mouth of an army of Russian trolls to silence discussions about Russian human rights crimes on social media. However, hate speech and the language of the totalitarian state cannot exist in a society alongside democratic values, just as pictures of Stalin and the admiration for the symbols of the system he represented cannot fit in the same space with democratic ideals. One of them must give way. I started keeping a diary when I was 6 years old, when I learned to write, and I carefully recorded things like the books I read, the temperatures in the winter. After first grade began, I started making notes about my homework and field trips, and my pile of journals quickly grew. And for decades, I thought I was documenting my everyday life. It was not until I was an adult that I realized what was strange about my childhood diaries. I always had a diary with me when we went to the Soviet Union, and yet I could not find anything about Estonia in my entries. The night before each trip, I would write about packing, but the following entries were from after we returned to Finland. So half of my life was actually missing from my diaries. Later I realized that my diaries were essential source after all, just not in the way I had imagined. Instead of details, they offered an opportunity to reflect on why I had left out everything related to the Soviet Union. In authoritarian and totalitarian system, children still learn what it is best to keep quiet about and what to use euphemisms for. They can read between the lines, but may not know how to talk about those hidden meanings using their proper names, let alone write about them. Or maybe I skipped everything related to the Soviet reality because of the mud on my grandmother's carpet. Just to be sure, because you never know. Albanian poet Albana Shala has observed that it takes time for someone who lived in a dictatorship to learn to search for information. In totalitarian system, seeking information is dangerous. Knowing too much is dangerous. I only realized as an adult how well I had internalized this. This is how effective KGB's preventive measures were. A friend of mine works in an NGO helping people who have escaped from North Korea. And one of her ideas was to take them to Auschwitz. The idea might seem a bit odd at first, but the expedition turned out to be a success. For Koreans, the concentration camp was a place they could relate to, much more than to the recreational places or trauma recovery centers that Westerners are used to. For Koreans, Auschwitz was a place they recognized, and for them it was important to understand they are not the only ones who have been taken to camps. That their system was not as unique as they were taught to believe. Above all, for them it was a revelation to see that a place like that can become a museum. For me, a similar kind of revelation was the moment when I understood that I have access to formally classified KGB material. It was concrete proof that those who had written the reports about us, those who had marked my grandmother's rug with mud, those who had left behind the cigarette smoke, those who listened to our phone calls and read our letters, all of them lost control. It was proof that those archives can become a museum, a past. And it was proof that there were no many of us targeted the same way. And even though I was looking for information, the sky did not fall, not at all. And I was kind of surprised about that. I know many people who, upon reading their own files, have had to leave the room to throw up. And maybe I would do the same if I were to read reports about us. But for me, going through KGB documents in general was liberating, and it helped me to demystify security orders and to create a language to write novels about them. And at the same time, I also learned the language to discuss it with others. I was able to connect with other people studying other totalitarian regimes. You see, the problem with hidden inside meanings and euphemisms is that nobody else understands them. Before you are brave enough to call a camp, you won't make yourself understandable to others, to those who study camps elsewhere. And if you cannot connect with others, you might just think the particular totalitarian regime you've been brought up in is unique, and therefore unbreakable, unbeatable. That it is so unique, it has unusual skills to prevail. And Russia is preaching about its uniqueness, just like the Soviet Union did, but neither of them is that unique. We don't need to find unforeseen weapons or tools to tackle Russia. We just have to pick them up from the old toolkit and learn to use them again in a better way. My countermeasure for the preventive measures was knowledge, language, and art. For me, having an access to KGB material was a pleasure, at least for a moment, a flickering moment. Whilst I was exploring bits and pieces of KGB reports they didn't manage to transport from Estonia, FSB in Russia had other plans for their future. Boris Yeltsin hadn't really valued the security organs and started cutting their budgets. But things changed when the old KGB men managed to get their own man in power. Archives in Russia began closing their doors, and within 2 decades, the security forces had taken over the power in the country. Those forces are using exactly the same methods as before to prevent the dissent and criticism towards Russia. That's why these preventive measures deserve much more attention than they received so far, and so does disinformation, which is also so closely connected to preventing dissent. In 1959, the Soviet Union established the disinformation department under the KGB. The creation of this new department was partly a result of the reputational damage caused by the exposure of Stalin's terror, and partly due to the poor economic success of the Soviet Union, which urged new practices to be put in place. The reconstruction of West Germany, which had laid in ruins after the war, progressed at a blistering pace, unlike in the Eastern Bloc, even though the Soviet Union was supposed to have been better than Western countries at everything. On the African continent, the West was pulling ahead by supporting countries financially. The Soviet Union was unable to do the same. There were challenges and on all fronts that the Soviet Union could not meet with money, so it had to come up with something else. Since catching up with the West or surpassing it was impossible, the Soviets decided to reduce the imbalance by undermining the West's reputation and eroding the US supremacy by tarnishing its halo. The goal was clear: to discredit and weaken opponents with lies and deceit. The goal hasn't changed. The reasons behind these methods haven't changed. Preventive measures and disinformation meet all the essential requirements for a perfect weapon. They are cheap. The attribution value is low. They stay below international news threshold. They won't interest politicians. They won't raise international mass protests, let alone smaller ones on the university campuses. And Amnesty International is not going to write petitions because of muddy footprints on someone's carpets nor on someone's Facebook page. And yet, they are very efficient in deterring and silencing people. There are some differences. The Communist Party no longer has control over the security organs, that's one. And the other one is the possibilities offered by the digital world. Before, the so-called Moscow rules meant that they didn't touch foreign diplomats. Havana syndrome has shown us that this is not the case anymore. Before, they were not known for leaving muddy footprints on anyone's home outside their own borders, but that has changed as well. Maybe it's another sign of Russia not knowing their borders, or maybe it's just that they are emboldened by their impunity. And there's one more difference compared to Soviet activities. There's a gendered emphasis on disinformation campaigns, which they didn't have back in the days to this extent. At the Stanford Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, Samantha Bradshaw and Amelie Henle have studied identity-based propaganda, and they found out that Russian military intelligence, GRU, and troll factories have been involved with meddling in the Women's March in 2017. And in personal attacks, they focus especially on female politicians and activists. If you think about in how many countries Russia is operating in the same manner, it's clear that the threat is global to women and gender equality, and yet this field is surprisingly underreported, under-researched, and underestimated. Women make a perfect target. There's online hate towards women all over the world, so no one can point the finger towards Russia at once. It could be anyone, right? It could be your ex-husband, it could be your stalker, it could be a woman hater next door, or it could be FSB or GRU. Russia no longer has an ideology like communism to export, and therefore they use misogyny masked as traditional values to find partner countries, but also to create like-minded communities in Western countries where gender equality is a central value. Russian-backed information operations due to the misogyny what baking powder does to a cake. Without a leavening agent, the cake remains flat. The same applies to racism and homophobia. In Russia, women don't have either political nor economical power, and the Kremlin likes to keep it that way. Hence, misogyny has also become a tool which the Kremlin uses to prevent women from rising to power in order to protect the position of the central government. It's a tool of imperialism and a tool used to oppress domestic opposition, where female activists used to be vocal. This turn towards misogyny gave me the push to write my latest book, Same River Twice, Putin's War Against Women, which is an essay unlike my previous books about Estonia's recent past. In my speech today, I didn't read from my novels, even though I'm a novelist by heart, but I did read some chapters from my essay book, published in English by HarperCollins as soon as possible. After Russia's invasion started in 2022, I have shared the feelings of many Ukrainian poets and authors who have turned into something else than poetry. Ukrainian poet Helena has said, "Metaphors do not work against a person with a machine gun. No poetry protects when a tank hits your car, in which you and your children are trying to escape from the war." And I say, the war Russia is waging against our symbols, our language, and our values cannot be won only by fiction and figurative speech. Demystifying Russia's psychological influencing requires direct expressions, because the subject needs to be taken more seriously in science, in politics. The thing is that Putin's regime can fail in anything except this one thing. They cannot fail in getting rid of dissent. That is the opposition. This is the one area they have not failed. And that is exactly why its methods of muffling dissent should get more attention. If not for Ukraine, or a different future for Russia, then for our sake. Or do you really think Russia wouldn't export their expertise on the one thing they are good at, the expertise of the field they have practiced for generations? We don't know how many people have changed their behavior because of mud on the bedroom carpet. We don't know how many people have changed their behavior because of threats on their social media. We don't know how many journalists have chosen another topic because of rape threats or lies about their private lives. Nor do we know the number of articles or books that remain unwritten or unpublished because of the same reason. We don't know how many women stay silent or decide to leave their activism behind or find another place to work because of this. We don't know how many mothers or grandmothers have encouraged their daughters to do so just because they want to protect their children. This organized, state-led staining, shaming, intimidation comes in many forms, and the goal is to prevent future Alexei Navalny's from being born. The goal is to prevent future Anna Politkovskaya's from being born. The goal is to prevent future Timothy Snyder's or Anna Applebaum's from being born, or authors like me. One pair of muddy footprints on your floor might not sound like important, but if you count them with thousands, hundreds of thousands, they make the full layer of soil burrowing underneath it the whole generation of people who could make the difference. And that's why every single grain of dirt they deliver deserves attention. Thank you.